Good evening from Manila, and good morning to those joining from North America, and a warm afternoon greetings to those joining from Europe. Thank you for joining, and welcome to the consultation on safeguards in private sector operations. This is part of ADB's ongoing safeguard policy review and update process, and it is the 19th of the 20 sets of regional consultations we have planned for phase 2 of the review process. My name is Gelson Garcia, your overall moderator for this consultation. This is the session with civil society, organization, and NGO stakeholders in North America and Europe. We have more than 60 registered participants in this session, where 40 are from outside ADB or our external stakeholders. 17 countries are represented here, mostly by CSOs from North America and Europe, followed by participants from Central and West Asia, South Asia, and the rest is from China. In this consultation, the ADB will present its safeguards for private sector operations and would like to hear from you later on the following. How is ADB applying its safeguards to private sector operations with the use of different financing instruments? What are the findings from the independent evaluation on its implementation effectiveness and the recommendations? How does ADB compare with its peer multilateral financing institutions when it did a benchmarking study for this review? And what are the key issues for consideration as ADB reflects and consults for the strengthening of safeguards in private sector operations? So your participation in this consultation is timely and important. And also thank you for bearing with us on the rescheduling of this consultation. And so we're finally having this consultation by the end of the year. And this, in fact, is the last session on safeguard policy consultation for the rest of the year, but there will be more to come next year. Before I call on our speakers, here's a few gentle meeting reminders. Please join us from a quiet, distraction-free area. Turn off your mic when you're not speaking. During the Q&A, you may ask questions by typing them in chat box or raising your hand. You will then be asked to unmute and turn on your camera so you can ask your questions live. We ask that you be respectful to everyone and that we will manage the time to keep with our schedule. IT support is provided, so you may ask for support by typing on the chat box. As you're joining by Zoom, here's a few guidance when using the important buttons. Right now, we're not using simultaneous interpretation, so we are using mainly English. We also ask that you use your proper name in Zoom for our documentation. If you wish to send a message, question, or feedback, please click the chat button. Also, please click on the rename button so that we can properly identify your name and your agency. To speak and unmute yourself, click on the microphone icon, and to share your video, click on the video icon. We value diverse and informed feedback from our wide range of stakeholders. So let me restate ADB's commitment to meaningful consultations. The Safeguard Policy Review and Update for Phase 2 consultations provide opportunities for stakeholders to express their views and opinions on ADB's environmental and social safeguards in the most meaningful and safest manner possible. All stakeholders are encouraged to articulate their inputs and concerns during these consultation sessions. By joining these sessions, stakeholders are consenting to the video and audio recording of these consultations and their subsequent release. ADB will prepare consultation summaries and disclose them publicly. This will ensure the accuracy and transparency of proceedings. For those wishing to exclude themselves from such recordings, you are asked to contact us, the Safeguard Policy Review and Update Secretariat at safeguardsupdate@adb.org within 2 weeks for this session to share your exceptions and exclusions. The recordings and documentation allow ADB to review, consider, and respond to, if necessary, any comments and inputs made. Background materials on the thematic areas have been released in preparation for the consultations. All types of feedback are welcome. This will not be used for the purposes of retaliation, abuse, or any kind of discrimination. If you have any concerns on the disclosure, recording, confidentiality, potential risks, abuse, or any kind of discrimination during the consultations, or wish to exclude yourself from the recording of events and discussions, please contact us at the Secretariat email. So we have 2 hours for this consultation. And here's how we structure the session in order to maximize our time. First, we'll have welcome remarks from Bruce Dunn, who is the Director of Safeguards Division for ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. Mr. Mark Conzer, the Director of the Private Sector Transaction Support Division under ADB's Private Sector Operations Department, will follow with his overview of private sector operations under the current ADB Safeguards Policy Statement and the IED findings. To complete the background for this consultation, Mr. Felix Oku, the Senior Social Development Specialist for Safeguards under Safeguards Division, will present the key findings and comparisons between ADB and other multilateral financing institutions regarding the policy architecture and the environmental and social systems management. We'll have a 5-minute break or screen break. After that, we will go to a 75-minute moderated discussion led by Mr. Richard Sherrington, the Principal Safeguard Specialist, also of the Private Sector Transaction Support Division of ADB's PSOD. We'll have a quick evaluation to follow. Then we'll conclude the consultation with a synthesis from Director Dunn. As such, and without further ado, I would like to call Director Dunn for his welcome remarks. Bruce?
Great, thanks very much, Jelson. And hi, good day, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today for this consultation on safeguards in the private sector. Really appreciate many of you joining. Looking at the participants list, I see a lot of colleagues that have joined these sessions before, so I really appreciate you coming back and looking forward to having a fruitful discussion. As many of you know that have been in the consultations previously, we're actually building these events. We've done a lot of different analytical studies, and now coming to private sector, and we also have another session still to be done in this process of doing the studies and consultations. Today on private sector, we've delayed one a bit on financing modalities, although they are linked. Partly the reason for that is the fact that we've been on the road constantly for the last 2 months doing a whole sort of range of consultations and needed a little bit more time. These topics are very important because we are very keen to look at how we obviously can adapt and improve the implementation of the existing safeguards, but that involves having to customize more for the different types of financing modalities that ADB supports. We have work that we do with governments. We provide policy-based lending and budget support. We have done a lot of that work during the COVID-19 pandemic. We have results-based lending. We work with financial intermediaries. Our private sector also works with corporate entities through a range of different types of financing, equity investments and debts. We also provide support for emergency assistance and a range of other things. So we have to look very carefully at how we can customize, and a little bit differently to some of the other MDBs that have updated their policies that have got a sort of set of standards and then a specific standard on financial intermediaries. ADB's existing policy actually covers all of the different lending modalities. And we ultimately need to then have guidance on how we apply the safeguards under different conditions. So that is a very important piece of work that we're still working on. Now, for this session today, what I wanted to do at the very beginning, before my colleagues go into more specific details on our private sector work, is just to update many of you on the approach and the progress that we've been making, and then a bit more in terms of the directions that we're looking at taking. Some of you that have been in recent consultations may have some of this background, but we often have people that are joining for the first time as well. So I'll try to quickly go through this just so everyone has a common background. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see here the approach and methodology that we've adopted for this process. We started in 2020. That was after the independent evaluation was completed on the safeguards that recommended we update and modernize the policy. We then prepared the background approach paper and a stakeholder engagement plan. We then moved into a series of analytical studies with linked consultations. And we've also been doing a lot of now country consultations, traveling to the region. But this work in the first two phases is now largely completed. And we are now working on the very first drafts of the policy paper and standards. So we're now moving through into this phase 3. On the current timetable, we are looking to take a draft working paper to our board in March next year, and then a final in October next year. However, we are a little bit behind schedule, and we are looking to push this back potentially by about 3 months. I'm waiting to confirm this finally with ADB management, and then we will update our website and update everyone. We've been getting tremendous inputs, but that then does take time to take all of those inputs from the consultations and think more carefully about it before we finalize any of the papers for public release. Once we, though, make it through this process and do have a new policy, we'll then go into stage 4, which will be the rollout. We're expecting to have 12 months after the policy approval, before then the new policy becomes effective. And during that time, we'll work on further guidance, our own staff instructions, preparation of good practice notes, and a whole lot of training and capacity building will have to kick off in that period. So that's the overall process. If we go to the next slide, it's a recap here on the list of the different analytical studies that we've completed, and all of these had linked consultations with civil society and our developing member countries. Plus, we also had some dedicated sessions with the private sector. And you'll see down the bottom, we do have one paper which is in draft, and it's being finalized for release next year before we do that final set of consultations on that topic. If we go to the next slide, I'd like to just give you a summary on sort of the overview of the consultation program. We've so far had about 100 individual consultation events with now almost 3,000 people, individuals that have joined the process. We've had tremendous involvement from civil society and international organizations. You can see there on the pie chart, we've had almost 40% of civil society, and roughly equal with our developing member countries. Plus, we've had focus groups with 56 of our private sector clients. And in addition to that, we added a special feature on studying and consulting with project-affected people. We've now gone back to 8 projects that have either been completed or are well into implementation. And we've done interviews and focus groups with the directly affected people to ask them about their experiences, what has worked, some good practices, but also some of the issues that have been challenging that we can learn from. And then recently we've had a set of 9 country consultations where we've been traveling with various members of our team out to this set of countries. Recently, in the last 3 weeks, we've had back-to-back work in the Philippines, India, and Indonesia. And we have one more of those, which is planned in January, so we'll have a set of 10 countries. Overall, we've had pretty good feedback from these. You can see some information there on the slide around the feedback that we've received and some of the information, the diagnostics there. I won't go into the details, but we've certainly been getting a lot of inputs, and we're now in the process of getting those consultation summaries to be uploaded on the website, and we'll be making a fuller consultation summary with then the responses and how we're addressing various feedback that we've been receiving and how we're addressing that into the policy update itself. So it's been a really full program, but we're now finding that we're a little bit squeezed in terms of having to spend some more time on the actual drafting. Now, I'll just go to one more slide to give you a bit of an insight in terms of how we're looking to structure the policy. One of the objectives that we've had is to have closer convergence with the policies of other multilateral financial institutions. We're quite keen to have greater convergence around policy structure and also international good practice. We believe that this will make it easier for our member countries and clients to understand the policies and more consistently implement the policies. It'll also make it easier for us to do co-financing work together with other organizations, and also to collaborate more consistently on capacity building. So the framework that we're putting together is quite consistent with what you may be familiar with from the IFC, the World Bank, EBRD, and many others. That's not to say that we're adopting completely the policy or exactly the structure of others, but we're trying to have a lot of convergence, and we're going through and benchmarking against the other policy frameworks, as well as the feedback that we're receiving from the consultations. And then I hope in the end we will have something consistent, but also with a blend that pushes up on key issues and also moves the practice forward. The structure itself, you'll see, will start with a vision statement, which will articulate how the safeguards will support on achieving ADB's long-term strategy, what we call our strategy 2030, and how that also in turn supports key priorities across the world and in our region, things like the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement on climate change. Also, of course, we would like to be able to support our member countries with meeting their obligations, including international commitments around human rights and other issues. So that sets a wide frame in terms of how safeguards will link and support those. Then if we come down to the second tier that you see on the slide here, we will have an environmental and social policy for the ADB. It will set out the key policy objectives, as well as being quite clear in terms of ADB's role and responsibility for things like risk assessment, for our due diligence role, for monitoring, for supervision, how we can ensure that the safeguards are implemented and met by our member countries and clients. We will also then have that complemented by a set of environmental and social standards. We're looking at this stage at a set of likely 10 standards, but this is still being worked on. It will start with a standard on the assessment and management of environmental and social risks, and we're looking there to have a more integrated framework, looking at a range of environmental and social issues, but also the relationships between them. Then we'll have a series of technical areas that will be covered, things like you've got labor and working conditions, pollution prevention and resource efficiency. You'll have health, safety and security, land acquisition. You'll also be looking at Indigenous peoples. We'll have cultural heritage. There'll be biodiversity. This sort of covers some of the main technical areas. Plus, we're also looking to have a standard on stakeholder engagement and information disclosure, and potentially a standard on climate change. In addition to that, it has been recommended that we should consider having a standard on gender equality, and that's also still under consideration. So the standards will be setting out the objectives and requirements for our clients. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we need to then customize that for the different types of financing modalities or financial instruments that ADB provides. So we'll be setting out an additional set of policy requirements for those. that's really the policy. Then that will be underpinned with what we call our operations manual and staff instructions, as well as other materials on client, environmental and social management systems. Then we will have guidance notes for each of the standards, as well as additional practice materials. So it's a framework, and I think that will be quite familiar to many of you. We're now starting to fill in the details, but obviously still a work in progress. So I hope that's just given a bit of a broad introduction on the direction that we're traveling in. With that, I'll now finish this intro, and I'll pass over to my colleague Mark Windsor, who will speak more about the private sector safeguards. So I'll pass over to you, Mark. Thanks.
Thank you, Bruce, and good morning, everybody. I'm going to begin with an apology. My normally reliable internet connection is unstable tonight, so if things start to go pear-shaped, I will turn the video off, but hopefully we'll get through this. So I'd like to begin with a very quick refresher on the structure of the current policy and how it deals with private sector operations. And I'll then summarize some of the findings of the independent evaluation of the policy that have relevance to the private sector. I think we're all aware of the three main policy areas of environment, involuntary resettlement and Indigenous peoples. And there are also three overarching policy objectives, which I'll quickly summarize. They are avoid adverse impacts where possible, minimize, mitigate, and/or compensate where avoidance is not possible, and to help borrowers strengthen their systems and build capacity. Other key parts of the policy will be Appendix 4, and that covers a number of private sector requirements, such as lending to financial intermediaries and corporate finance. Another very vital part of the policy is Appendix 5, which covers the prohibited investment activities list. Next slide, please. So where do we find the private sector requirements in the policy? The bulk of the policy document deals with project finance, and the safeguard requirements 1 to 3 apply to both private sector and sovereign lending. Private sector deals often require financing for improvements to existing facilities, and these deals require an environmental and social audit to be undertaken. The key requirement for financial intermediary transactions are that the client develops an appropriate environmental and social management system, unless their lending will have no adverse social or environmental risks, and in which case this doesn't apply. For corporate finance, there are two requirements. Firstly, the client develops an ESMS, and if the loan will be used to finance specific projects, then the environmental, social, and Indigenous peoples requirements apply as well. Just a quick note here, private sector lending does not involve program or sector lending. We don't offer multi-tranche financing facilities or emergency loans. Next slide, please. I'd like to now summarize some of the findings that came out of the evaluation study. Here at ADB, we consider that evaluation is really essential to increasing the effectiveness of our development assistance. And so we have an independent evaluation department that reviews all aspects of our operations, from policies through to evaluations of individual projects. In April 2020, IED published an evaluation of the safeguards policy and how it's been implemented in ADB's operations from the period of 2010 to 2018. So I'm going to take a little time to go over some of the key findings here. And if you're interested, you can also find this report online. And there is an ADB IED webpage, which we'll share the link with you if anyone is interested. But first, a little background. The ADB safeguards policy was 10 years old in 2018 when the evaluation was undertaken. In dollar terms, increasing from 16 billion in 2009 to 31 billion in 2020. And during this time, the number of approved projects also increased. At the same time, private sector lending also increased significantly, from just 14% of ADB's lending in 2009 to today, where the private sector department is moving towards a target of 30% of the bank's total business. So going through some of the highlights of the evaluation. Such as promoting the development of the green bond market in Asia, the establishment of our trade finance and supply chain finance programs, and our role as an anchor investor in various public share offerings. ADB Strategy 2030 sets a target for private sector operations 50 of co-financing for every $1 we lend. So this crowding in requirement means that we are regularly partnering with other IFIs, and the evaluation highlights the needs for better harmonization of policies with our partners. In the private sector department, we spend a lot of time working with our clients on developing or improving their environmental and social management systems, and this effort is appreciated. And we also have a strong focus on the management of labor and working conditions in our projects and with our clients. We've also supported our financial intermediary partners in the same way. And in addition, we have an annual audit program in place. So normally audits are not generally appreciated, but our FI clients see them more as a training opportunity than a compliance visit. So next slide, please. So let's also go through some of the evaluation. As I mentioned earlier, projects and the policies is not well adapted or customized to support private sector financing. So the policy doesn't recognize differences between sovereign and private sector operations in both culture and practice. And one of the differences here is the private sector's entry point into the project cycle. This is usually much later than for sovereign projects. So private sector projects may have already established procedures which may or may not be consistent with our policy. They may have completed part of the regulatory EIA process. They may even have started construction. So this does not allow us much room for meaningful consultation or design adjustments. In the last slide, we highlighted that PSOD has done good work with our FI clients. However, there's obviously still some way to go here, as the evaluation found that managing safeguards in FI projects is incomplete at both policy and delivery levels. One final point on this slide regarding ADB disclosure requirements that's very crucial for private sector operations. The 120-day disclosure period for Category A projects is not aligned with other MFIs. Next slide, please. So the overall assessment of private sector operations is that our safeguards performance is as good as or better than sovereign projects. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through this slide in detail, but instead I'll give you my personal view as to some of the reasons why this might be. So firstly, project preparation. In the private sector, we require our clients to pay for the preparation of the required environmental and social documents and to undertake the necessary assessments. And this means our clients can hire the major environmental and social consultancies to do this work. Our colleagues in sovereign departments often don't have this option, as the project preparation is funded by ADB through grant financing. And our cost ceilings often preclude the use of the major consultancy firms. In my view, this results in private sector projects getting a much better standard of environmental and social documentation. Moving on to project implementation, I'd suggest that performance here is guided by two factors. These are the commitment of PSOD specialists to getting our projects to deliver the expected development impacts and the leverage that we have with our clients. Our clients are able to react much faster and more nimbly than government departments or implementing agencies, and are also very dependent on the ADB finance to keep a project moving. This leverage, therefore, allows us to achieve effective project implementation. The final point is again about commitment and how it relates to capacity. The private sector department is very unlikely to work with clients that don't share our vision and goals. If they're reluctant to adopt our environmental and social requirements, we're even more reluctant to lend to them. So our clients' commitment to ESG means they're usually very receptive to training and capacity building, and that I feel is an important reason why we managed to get such great improvements and gains in capacity. Next slide, please. So let me try and summarize the recommendations of the evaluation with respect to private sector operations. Harmonization with other MFIs is a key requirement. We're out of sync with our partners, and we're also the slowest IFI with our processing times. We require shorter disclosure periods, as the 120-day rule is twice as long as our co-financing partners. More guidance for both staff and clients is needed, along with regular training and updates. And we also need more staff to enable us to more effectively prepare and implement projects, with a particular emphasis on more supervision. So I'll end the presentation there, and let me hand you over to Felix, who will do the third part of the presentation. Felix, over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Thank you very much, Mark, and Bruce, for the earlier presentations. Bruce, first of all, for the proposed policy architecture, the draft highlighting key areas that have already been identified for further work. And then Mark as well giving the private sector perspective in line with the IAD findings on the effectiveness of the application of the SPS 2009. So this part of the presentation will look at comparative or benchmarking studies that ADB undertook as part of the analytical technical studies to inform the policy update. And the objective of this comparative assessment or benchmarking exercise, as Mark highlighted, was to gauge how ADB is performing with its peer and sister institutions or comparator institutions, and also to provide a leverage for harmonizing for most of the co-lending and co-financing that we do with our sister institutions. If you go to the next slide, as part of the benchmarking exercise, ADB identified comparator institutions, and the basis for the selection of these comparator institutions is based on two key parameters. One, because of similarity of business module and size of portfolio. And then two, also in many instances, overlap in regional coverage and co-financing in most transactions. So ADB SPS 2009 was benchmarked against the IFC sustainability framework, of which the performance standard is a key component. The performance standard did come into effect 2006. The latest version of the performance standards is June 2012 and is already being looked to be scheduled for update. Then next identified was the EBRD's environmental and social policy, drafted into 2014, latest update 2019, also being scheduled for update. And then IDB Invest, the private sector arm of IDB. So these comparator institutions quite very look similar in approach and the business model to ADB. And the objective of the benchmark exercise, just to reemphasize again, was to gauge how we're performing with our safeguard policies and identify areas where we think there are gaps, and also where we think there could be opportunities to enhance our safeguards to align with our peer institutions. So the year of approval is on the table. ADB SPS, as I've highlighted, against the IFC performance standards of sustainability framework, EBRD environmental and social policy, and then IDB environmental and social policy framework. Bruce has highlighted the policy architecture on the way forward, and that aligns pretty much with what our peer institutions have got. There is an overarching or umbrella ENS policy, and that is covered in all the 3 safeguard policies of our peer institutions. With the SPS, we do have an overarching safeguard policy, but it also covers broader corporate policies that mainstream aspirational elements of safeguards, including the Qualified standards. We have that as well sharing in our prohibited investment list, which appears also on a negative list or prohibited list of our peer institutions, such as the IFC, EBRD, and IDB Invest. In terms of coverage of financing modalities, Mark had already highlighted some of them, and Bruce had touched on in terms specifically private sector, financing instruments such as financial intermediation or FIs. We have corporate finance, both for debt and equity investments. And then we also have other modes of financial transactions that are emerging, including capital market transactions, including bond and social responsibility bonds that are being currently cropping up. The ADB SPS has a special requirement section, SR4, we call it, that details the safeguards requirements underpinning each of the financing modalities or financing instruments that we've just talked about. And there's SR4, you have guidance on FI, that's financial intermediation transactions. You also have guidance on general corporate finance, of which corporate finance is made a unique element of. Then we have also the unique environment or situation called existing facilities, not necessarily a financing instrument, but it covers a significant portion of private sector transactions due to the different entry points or timing of entries, where private sector enters into deals, where deals may have already evolved post the design stage, as Mark highlighted. That is also seen to be the case with our sister and peer institutions. In terms of policy design, you could argue that most or all the policies are principle-based in nature and by way of architecture, but the significant difference between the ADB SPS and that of our peer institutions lies within the provision of detailed guidance. So the IFC has guidance notes, and these guidance notes provide various guidance to highlight what each of the policy statements and standards mean to the client and to the borrower and any development partner engaging with the IFC. The same is seen also with the EBRD's performance requirements, where specific guidances are provided to explain various paragraphs of the policy document. So borrowers and clients and other development partners are quite very clear on their responsibilities and the obligations for projects that they engage IFC, EBRD, or IDB Invest. In terms of process for managing safeguards, the ADB SPS was noted to be a bit more front-loaded in that a lot of the assessments for safeguards and management planning are required to be completed prior to presenting the project for board for consideration approval. Whereas the IFC, EBRD, and IDB Invest do maintain this compliance over time and could be deemed to be a continuous process. The main safeguards instrument that enables that safeguard compliance over time has to do with environmental and social action planning, ESAP, which is quite common with all 3 of them. All safeguards assessment and management plans, which are deemed not completed before board approval, could be leveraged within the ESAP for completion and monitoring during project implementation. In terms of environmental assessment, risks, and impacts, ADB has 3 separate safeguards. We have environment safeguards, we have indigenous people safeguards, and safeguards for involuntary settlement. These 3 safeguards are assessed and categorized, screened and categorized separately, and the ensuing assessment and management planning for safeguards are also done separately. Although there is a team, the safeguards people within the project team work quite very closely together to ensure areas of integrations are identified upstream and leveraged within the instruments that are prepared. For private sector though, regardless of this separation of the safeguard, 3 safeguards, a lot of the instruments that are prepared are quite very much integrated because of the collaboration or co-financing with the other peer institutions and the need to harmonize some of this preparation of these instruments. When you look at our peer institutions like the IFC, DBRD, and IDB Invest, there is the overarching or first standard, which Bruce mentioned as part of the policy architecture framework that will be adopted. And that is the standard one that mainstreams the assessment and management planning for environmental and social risks. For the IFC, that is noted as performance standard 1. For EBRD, that is performance requirement 1. And for IDB Invest, that is environmental and social policy standard 1. That is the entry point for assessment for the risk and application of the other standards. For IFC, they call 8, and then EBRD 9, 10, and what have you. So that is what serves as the baseline for which all the impact and triggers for other standards are assessed. In terms of project categorization, I've already hinted and explained that ADB categorizes the safeguards quite separately and may pose a very siloed approach to how you categorize and screen safeguards. Whereas there is consistency across sister institutions where an integrated approach is what is normally employed in terms of safeguard categorization. There is an overall safeguard risk category that is assigned to a project based upon which of the standards are triggered for each of the transactions. In terms of project categorization, we more or less benchmark quite very largely against our sister institutions in that you have ABC categorizations where A, significant impact across 3 safeguards, B, it could be localized, and then C, with no impact. We have separate safeguard categorization for financial intimidation transactions, FIs, and we have a unique category of projects that we call highly complex and sensitive. Our sister institutions also do have separate categorizations, 3-pronged categorizations for project transactions, ABC, also with a separate categorization for financial intimidation, FIs. What is marked different though is our FI categorization could be argued to be only 2 main forms of categorizations, where you have FI and FI treated as C. So FI treated as C across any of the 3 safeguards means that the impact is quite minimal, or for involuntary settlement, potentially no impact. But where we have FI, then it's deemed to be able to accommodate sub-project with potential environmental and social categories that could be significant and moderate. That is A or B, unless these are specified to be excluded within the project preparation document, such as the report and recommendation for the president and other associated link documents that come with it. IDB has already edged out to take maybe a 4-tier dynamic categorization process, which is quite very similar to the World Bank. That's the public sector arm of the World Bank Group, IDA and IBRD. And that has a higher, significant, substantial, medium or moderate and low basis of categorization. So if you look at the table overall, there is alignment, but there are also areas where ADB's SPS, having been in existence for well over a decade, requires a bit of enhancement to be able to align with our peer institutions. And those areas have been identified as already indicated by Bruce by way of categorization in terms of policy architecture and framing and structuring and development of bespoke standards for each of the areas. If we go to the next slide, we keep on looking at the various domains and areas where the benchmarking had been done. And one of the key areas that have been talked about, especially for our FI, means of work has to do with stakeholder engagement planning throughout project cycle. With ADB is mainstreamed, we don't have a separate standard that deals with stakeholder engagement planning. We see that to be the case with our peer institutions, and Bruce has already indicated in the policy architecture that that was the way forward. Where IFC, they have a standard for stakeholder engagement planning, EBRD, IDB Invest as well, and that necessitates the development of stakeholder engagement plans as part of the project documents that are prepared and disclosed. For instrument for SI, the environmental and social management system seems to be the bedrock across board, and ADB quite benchmarks quite very well with our peer institutions in that framework. Mark has alluded exactly what happens at project level And the report of the IADB has also demonstrated how PSOD to a very large extent had performed quite very well when it comes into mainstreaming ESMS and assessing client capacity to manage potential environmental and social impact with existing and planned portfolio for projects. Additional requirements for FIs not clearly spelled out because of guidance. SR4 has very limited guidance in terms of FI transactions, although that now constitutes quite a very big portfolio of private sector operations. When you go to IFC, there are classifications. IFC has no separate standard for FIs, as EBRD has in performance requirement 9, but IFC has an interpretation note, which makes up for that absence of that separate standard for FI. And IDB investors were similarly, but that is incorporated into performance standard 1 and then performance standard 2, which has to do with labor and working conditions for the FI. In terms of how Safeguard is managed and implemented, there is an adaptive and quite very responsive approach that we've observed across our peer institutions like the IFC. As I explained, categorization is dynamic, EBRD as well is dynamic. There's also compliance over time during implementation. That doesn't seem to be the case because of the front-loaded nature of ADB's SPS. And as Bruce indicated, with the way forward, that has also been one of the areas that have been identified to be worked on. Consistently, I think mentioned there was a discrepancy in terms of disclosure requirement for category A rated project across 3 safeguards for ADB against our sister institutions. And that line on the table just highlighted, I think Mark really made a good case on that. We require 120 days for environment category A projects, whereas our peer institutions, it's half of that requirement for their private sector transactions. In terms of location of disclosure requirement, there is provision in the SPS and also our access to information policy 2019. ADB webpage is deemed to be the place that the disclosure must happen for the clock to start ticking, especially for category environmental projects. But to make sure we achieve effective disclosure of information and enable public participation for project level, a lot more enhancements will be required. And I think Bruce has already mentioned that it's one area that has been identified. But across board, we benchmark quite very well with our sister institutions in all of us adopting access to information policy in one way or the other. The next 2 slides will highlight those gaps that I've mentioned and those opportunities that we've identified as part of the benchmark exercise that will require further assessment for the policy updates. Next slide, please. So the first part of the presentation has to do with safeguard risk categorization and risk management. That is the critical entry point for assessing and management planning for safeguards impact throughout the entire project cycle. We have noticed that it's a bit very, very front-loaded for private sector transactions where we have corporate in terms of debt and equity participation or investment and financial intermediation, that we need a bit more work in providing clarity, developing guidance that would underpin those standard requirements so that clients and borrowers who deal with ADB will be quite very clear what the requirements are. So that alignment has been identified, and I think Bruce just mentioned it, and there are various options that have been looked, I think. I mentioned we don't have a separate standalone stakeholder engagement planning standard, and that has also been identified to be one of the areas where a standard will be developed to align with our sister and peer institutions to ensure that we create a very robust and effective disclosure of information and public participation engagement at project level. Guidance and good practice note for applying the revised policy and due diligence as well will be included. Another area where I think has been identified for enhancements within the SPS update is the information disclosure. And this more or less, I think a lot has been said with FI disclosure of information, but there's a need to align. We've seen the discrepancy between the period of disclosure for category environmental projects that is being looked at, especially for private sector clients, as well as the mode of disclosure, whether it is sticking things on ADB web pages for 120 days would aid effective disclosure of information and will allow meaningful consultation to take place prior to board approval with affected people. I think that's also something that needs to be looked at to make sure whatever is adopted is fit for purpose. Next slide. I think the last two areas has to do with monitoring, and the ID report that assess the effectiveness of the SPS implementation identified monitoring as one of the areas which required strengthening. Because of the front-loaded nature of ADB safeguards assessment, monitoring was reported to be not commensurate with the risk that pertains to the project portfolio. So there is a lot that needs to be done to strengthen client and borrowers' capacity, first of all, strengthen project monitoring and reporting mechanisms at project level to be able to highlight risks and impact during project implementation. So a risk-based approach could be adopted to respond on interventions to address those risks and impacts. And last but not the least is the issue with guidance notes. So guidance notes within two contexts. First of all, guidance notes to underpin the policy standards that will be drafted, providing clarity on the policy requirement for each of the paragraphs within the standards. But that also includes compendium of toolkits constituting good practice on various topical issues and thematic issues across all the safeguards areas, so that clients and borrowers may be able to identify in areas where those good practices may deem applicable. Particular worth of notice here for private sector in particular has to do with FIs, because I mentioned a safeguard requirement for is quite very limited in providing guidance for financial intimidation transactions, general corporate finance, and corporate finance, and other emerging areas, as I've mentioned to you, capital market transactions such as the bond market. I think I will end here and allow for questions, and this is where I give it back to Justin.
Thank you, Felix. Also, thank you to Bruce and Mark. With your three presentations, I hope we have provided enough background information or context to prompt questions and specific comments. Before we move to our question time, let's pause for a 5-minute break. I think it's time for your coffee. You're joining us from US or Canada, maybe tea from Europe, and favorite drink for others. We'll have music played during the break. Once it's turned off, it means that we're ready for the open forum. So see you after 5 minutes. Thank you. Welcome back. We're now moving to our next session, which is a moderated discussion. We have 75 minutes for this session, so we hope that you have formulated your questions, comments, feedback. And Mr. Richard Sherrington, the Principal Safeguard Specialist of the Private Sector Transaction Support Division of ADB's Private Sector Operations Department, will moderate the session. So over to you, Richard.
Thanks very much, Jelson, and a warm welcome to everybody who's taken time to join our call today. Your inputs are greatly appreciated, as is your time. We've heard from three of my colleagues today. Bruce, who's given you an update on what we've achieved so far in terms of consultations and some directions that's taken us through and down. You've also heard from Mark, who's giving you at a high level what the policy infrastructure looks like, and also some of the results from the independent evaluation that we had done on our previous SPS and some of the projects as well. And then Felix, of course, who's given us a good overview of how ADB has compared to date in terms of what the SPS 2009 looks like. In terms of process, I can see people have already got their hands up, which is great. So I was going to just remind people that there are two avenues, two main avenues, I should say, through which participants can raise questions or recommendations or concerns. And the first one being hands up. So what I'll do is, I'm not sure who was first. I think Kate Geary from Recourse. I'll hand the microphone over to you, Kate, if you don't mind. Thanks.
Hello there, and thanks very much for the presentations. And my name is Kate Geary. I'm co-director at Recourse, based in Oxford in the UK. And my question relates to ADB's financial intermediary lending, because by its nature, it's higher risk than direct lending due to delegation of responsibility for safeguards implementation down a longer investment chain. So the problem with ensuring effective safeguard implementation at the sub-project level in FI lending was recognised in the independent evaluation report that you mentioned. And I'd just like to quote from that. It said, projects implemented through FIs have remained the weakest performers on safeguards. So given this, I'd like to know two things. First, what work has the ADB done to identify why FI sub-projects are the weakest on safeguards implementation? So have you looked into, for example, complaints to your accountability mechanism and lessons learned from these? And if so, what are they? And how do you propose to fill those gaps in the new SPS? So that's one item. The second question, my final question, is that we found from our experience at other MDBs that one reason for poor safeguards implementation at the sub-project level is that demonstrated by a recent IFC FI case, where IFC supported a Philippine bank, which then funded coal plants throughout the Philippines. And this was the failure of the IFC to ensure that its FI client included the performance standards in its contract with the sub-borrowers, in other words, the coal plant developers. So my question is this, does the ADB ensure that its FI clients include the SPS requirements in contracts right down to the sub-project level? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kate. I know Mark has a dodgy microphone, but I'm going to go to Mark first because I know he's talked about some of these points before. And if that fails, then Bruce can chime in as well. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Richard. Hi, Kate. Yeah, it is a topic that we've been watching with much interest over the years. The IED evaluation has identified it as an issue within ADB as well. However, I'd like to first just give you some more context in the private sector portfolio of FI clients in ADB and where we think the risks there lie. So our portfolio is a little different from a lot of the other IFIs. Some 40% of our FI clients are involved in microcredit, microfinance work, and the size of the loans that they're offering, the maximum is usually somewhere between $500 to $2,000, and the average is much lower than that, usually about $100. So we don't feel that there is a lot of safeguard risk associated with those type of clients. I think there are other risks there, such as the ability of clients to be able to pay and their other indebtedness levels, etc., etc. But that is also something that we work with our clients very carefully to ensure that they're enforcing these sort of criteria. The other 60% or so of our portfolio are FI clients who are limited by our loan agreements to only offering loans to projects or clients who will be undertaking category B or C projects. We only have 3 FI clients that can do category A projects, and I think it's only 2 of those have actually funded them. So the balance of our portfolio is a little different from, for example, you raised the issue of IFC and the Philippines Bank, which build a lot of coal-fired power stations. That wouldn't have occurred with us, we hope. But it is still a problem, and it is obviously one of the key risks associated with working with FIs, as we are delegating our responsibilities to some extent. How are we going to manage that? We do it by 2 ways. We make sure our legal agreements clearly state what our requirements are. We monitor where possible. Obviously, we have to take a risk-based approach, because I think if my team was to spend its entire time visiting microfinance lenders in parts of Asia, we wouldn't have time to do anything else. So we have to focus where we think the risks are. But what we also do is, and I mentioned it briefly in the presentation, is we have a rolling annual audit program, unfortunately interrupted by COVID, where we send out an independent auditor to go and visit our FI clients and look at their systems, understand how they're working, where they're failing, and working with them to improve that. So where are the weaknesses? I think, as identified in the various presentations, we need more staff on the ground to be able to effectively work with our FI clients, build their capacity, and work with them when there are problems there. I don't believe ADB has had a complaint to our accountability mechanism about an FI client in the private sector. I'm not that familiar with some of our sovereign projects, so maybe Bruce can chip in at the end there. However, if we do have an FI client that is allowed to fund category A projects, we would expect them to undergo the full safeguards process within the policy, and that would be clearly stated in our legal agreements. As we only have 2 clients that I'm aware of that have done that, the issue of have they failed to pass on or pass down these requirements through the contracts, various levels of contracts, hasn't occurred yet. One of the clients that we have is the Indonesian Infrastructure Fund, which we invested in way before the start of our current policy, so that was pre-2009. We still hold equity in the fund, and we have a seat on the board that we share with IFC and others. And the other fund is Clifford Capital out of Singapore, and they use their funds to buy B loans for ADB projects that are on the market. So they package securities together, and we are then certain that those projects are compliant with ADB policy because we've approved them already and we're monitoring them. So our context is slightly different to some of the other IFIs. I think our risk profile is therefore much lower. I'm not saying we don't have any, and we still have a lot of work to do to improve on this. So I've sort of answered your question there. Bruce, would you like to add anything to that?
Sure. Yeah, thanks very much. And thanks, Kate. Good points to kick us off on. Yeah, firstly, I'll just mention on the FI investments that we've had that have gone through to the accountability mechanism and the lessons learned. So far, actually, only one, which was in our sovereign portfolio from India. The complaint was ultimately found ineligible for the accountability mechanism. It was proposed, and actually part of the ineligibility was on a technicality that the loan was actually already closed, and the complaint had come in after the cutoff period for the accountability mechanism to be triggered. But regardless of that, the main aspect of the complaint was around the non-payment of wages to workers, which had occurred because there was a sub-investment that was made in a toll road through a special purpose vehicle that had been established for that, which had engaged a EPC contractor, which subsequently went bankrupt and hadn't paid out all of the wages to the workers. So it wasn't technically triggered or related to the safeguards. Wages are not usually covered through that and needed to be addressed through the bankruptcy laws and the process of liquidation of the contractor. So that was the main aspect of it. But I think regardless of that, there are still some lessons that are, I guess, also resonate with some of the points that you've mentioned around. Of course, you have a cascade of, to the original FI, then to a sub-investment, and then also to contractors. And you do need to look at how you can, cascade those requirements down. We do make it clear through the loan or financing agreements to the financial intermediary on our requirements, and that those requirements need to be cascaded down through the process. But then obviously it does need to be monitored in the way that Mark was mentioning. But we see this not just with financial intermediaries, but also, generally with the roles of, contractors and subcontractors, and particularly looking at labour issues in terms of, how that should be monitored. And I think there's a whole other space that maybe we can get into in another part of the consultation around strengthening procurement. But maybe for now I'll stop so we can take in other questions. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Mark. And thanks, Bruce. Yeah, we've got a few hands coming up. I think Lenny Wendland is next from the UN. So Lenny, I'll pass you the mic. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And thanks a lot for this opportunity. It's very much appreciated. I have more of a comment rather than a question, and I'd like to flag why OHCHR believes it's important that ADB's new safeguards integrate and align with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. So I'm sure everyone on the call will know that the UN guiding principles are the authoritative global standard to address business impact on human rights. They resulted from a 6-year in-depth research and multi-stakeholder consultation process across multiple jurisdictions and sectors, and were unanimously endorsed by the UN Human Rights Council in 2011. And they've been widely accepted across the business community and a host of other actors. We had a panel at the UN last year commemorating the 10th anniversary of the guiding principles, and states from all regions reiterated their commitments to the guiding principles. Of particular note is that the chair of the non-aligned movement, emphasizing full support of the UN guiding principles by NAM states, of which many are ADB members. Ensuring one of the key things of the guiding principles is the question about policy coherence, and ensuring that ADB safeguards align with the guiding principles will enhance policy coherence. There are many different standards and regulatory developments clients need to take into account, but at the core, many of these developments are aligned with or based on the UN Guiding Principles framework. And just to mention a few examples, the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, the ILO M&E declaration, ISO 26000 and Equator principles, which cover 70% of project finance in emerging economies, integrate the UNGPs in some fashion. There are recent national and regional regulatory developments, particularly those regarding reporting requirements and mandatory human rights due diligence, do or may apply to Asian private sector operations and build on the guiding principles. So by integrating the UNGPs in the ADB safeguards, clients can be confident that complying with standards safeguards mean that they'll be well positioned to comply also with these demands. And finally, just a few points, if you allow me, about how the UNGPs can be usefully integrated. My office will submit more detailed comments in writing, but I'll just highlight quickly 3 areas where the UNGPs can strengthen due diligence and ENS risk management based on OHCHR's research and consultations with development finance institutions. So firstly, on the human rights due diligence, the UNGPs define and set out how to conduct human rights due diligence, which involves assessing actual and potential impacts, integrating and acting upon findings, tracking responses, and communicating how impacts are addressed. Where human rights due diligence is recognized in DFI safeguards, it's often equated with human rights impact assessments alone and or limited to high-risk circumstances rather than as a central routine aspect of risk management systems. So the potential value of human rights due diligence to inform risk classification at the outset and dynamically thereafter throughout the project cycle is missed. The scope, the guiding principles lay out how to conduct such due diligence through value chains without any categorical limitations or carve-outs and encourage building leverage. Under DFI safeguards, the client's risk management responsibilities are often limited to primary suppliers or defined by reference to their existing control and influence and do not necessarily encourage the client to build and exercise leverage. And this can result in severe environmental and social impacts escaping the attention of the DFIs and clients. And very finally, assessing involvement in impacts, the guiding principles framework outlines how the responsibilities of different actors may differ depending on how they are involved with the impact. We've written at length at how this involvement framework applies in the finance sector and certain commercial banks, and DFIs have begun to apply it. However, most DFI safeguards do not consider the extent to which DFI's own actions and omissions may have contributed to or are linked to negative impacts and the consequences which should follow, for instance, as regards exercising different forms of leverage. So ensuring alignment with the guiding principle will thus help enhance beneficial safeguard outcomes for the environment and affected people. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Lene. I don't know, lots of information there, and of course we'll warmly welcome any additional information that you mentioned you might submit to us. But Bruce, I don't know if there anything that you want to reflect on quickly before we move on.
Yes, thanks very much, Richard, and thanks, Lene. Really appreciate joining today, and also the sustained engagement that we've had from the UN Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights and the submissions that we received from you. That was a nice condensed summary, actually, and if you're happy to share that over, that would be useful. But actually, we are overdue for a follow-up meeting. Actually, Magdara and I are planning for something in November, and have not been able to fulfill that due to our schedule, but I'd like to in the new year to come back and have a follow-up consultation. Just to say a few things, we have been looking at the UN Guiding Principles quite carefully and having some discussions around those. Clearly human rights are very important for the work that we do at a wider strategic level in terms of helping the countries that we work with and the clients that we work with to ensure human rights are maintained or addressed. We're wanting to give some recognition to that in the new policy framework. Human rights are not explicitly referenced in the existing policy, with the exception of our Indigenous peoples requirements. That does have a reference to human rights, but not substantively sort of then addressed in the framework. We are looking at that. We're trying to think through, though, how to embody that in a set of clear requirements without having multiple processes. The safeguards are intended to set out a clear set of objectives and requirements that our borrowers should undertake in the context of receiving financing from ADB, and that we can also apply under different circumstances. And we'd like to have one clear set of processes and procedures rather than multiple and overlapping processes, which can be somewhat of a challenge. So I think our preferred approach, although not by all means final, is to look at where the existing safeguards already cover relevant human rights issues and where there might be gaps in that framework relevant to our safeguards where that could be strengthened, so we can have a consistent set of requirements. But in addition to that, we are looking to update and strengthen the the risk screening process that we undertake for all of our projects, which encompasses information that we receive and information that we require from our borrowers and clients. But we would also seek to add an additional layer to this process that we're broadly calling a contextual analysis, which can encompass human rights issues and elements of human rights due diligence, but also other factors that we feel are quite important for the way we work and the countries that we work in. For example, looking at governance, fragility, resilience, and these types of issues, which we're also looking at through our FCAS and SIDS approach. We also need to look broadly at the performance and track record of the borrowers and bring these factors together so that we have a holistic perspective on all the different types of risk factors that may occur in an investment and how we can address that. Of course, at a macro level, it also informs whether there are certain types of investments that are too risky, that we may want to stay away from, but also how you then go in and manage issues. For example, looking at, are there the conditions under which you could undertake meaningful consultation in certain contexts? Are there suppression on free speech, or perhaps the use of military or police forces that could intimidate stakeholders? And of course, there's a wide range of other issues that we need to consider in the context and then set out environmental and social commitments, which we can link into our requirements and legal agreements, and then the monitoring arrangements. So we're trying to look at it sort of holistically from the framework and see where we can, strengthen that. I think it'd be really good though for us to follow up and have sort of more of a detailed discussion on what we're thinking there, and to get you further, thoughts and recommendations. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. I think Mark just has a really quick comment, and then we're going to move on to Grant Hauber. So yeah, Mark, just quickly on this one.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I just wanted to highlight probably one not very well known route whereby we already look at human rights issues in our due diligence process in the private sector. My team does all the integrity due diligence, which is similar to the sort of the KYC done by commercial banks. Part of that is to do some fairly wide-ranging searches where we're looking for adverse media. And I think if a client had, let me get my adverse media relating to human rights issues for a potential client, we'd start to ask some very hard questions about whether we want to actually do business with them. Obviously, that's just a very small part of the overall process, and we look forward to seeing how this is going to develop as we develop the new policy. Thanks, Richard.
Great, thanks, Mark. Yeah, apologies for everyone waiting. We do see the hands up, and hopefully we're messaging you in the meeting chat to acknowledge that. But Grant Hauber, I'll hand the microphone over to you.
Yes, thank you. My name is Grant Hauber. I'm from the Institute of Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, a global NGO based in the US. One thing I wanted to do is just put my comments here in the context of a previous position that we'd taken in prior consultation on this SPS process, is that we are looking at this in the context of ADB's now stated a desire to align with the Paris Agreement principles this year and in coming years, in 2023. And that, our comments are looking at both climate change impacts and sustainability impacts as would ideally be embedded in a safeguards process for bank investment projects. Also to putting this in the context of this is a policy adjustment that's looking towards the future. So the future demands, scale, and scope of that private sector operations may be called upon in which to participate. So this might be looking at financial intermediaries beyond microfinance. And I think a good case for this possibility is thinking to put this into a thought frame. Think about the proposed energy transition mechanism that is on the table for Indonesia right now. There are, if you look at all the elements that are in that proposal across both ADB and multiple other actors, there includes in that a very large component of financial intermediary lending to a state-owned enterprise called PTSMI, which is looking to advance the goals of a transition mechanism in there. We are talking one of the largest MDB operations ever considered at $20 billion total for this, of which ADB has a proposed component in the hundreds of millions, if not billions, across multiple elements. So when I look at these proposed standards, I look at it in that context. What possibly could the bank be asked to do? Will they be asked to step up in both private sector and sovereign operations in lending to something like this that has both, highly environmental impactful elements, both positively and negatively, as well as social and other elements to this. So in that context, it is, I think, important to think about standards that relate to extending additional finance to entities that are already being financed by ADB, refinancing those facilities, which is also permitted under your operations manuals and policies, as well as obviously for new loans. I do not believe, our institution doesn't believe that, standards should remain grandfathered. If you are looking to refinance someone who is engaged in businesses that are now not Paris compliant, Paris aligned, or introduce risk for sustainability or climate change impacts, thinking about not extending those facilities is something that should be on the table, and or helping those institutions in advance of a need for expansion or refinance to evolve their principles to be Paris aligned and or aligned with the NDCs of a given country. Because standards are not static. And this, I guess, gets to that observation from the independent evaluation report. It said ADB's approach is often very front-end loaded, initial approval based, versus an ongoing compliance and adjustment protocol. I think if you look at climate change mitigation, adaptation, and sustainability in the light of an ongoing process, it becomes all the more important to have that life cycle approach to safeguard support in private sector operations lending. One area where this becomes important, you'd also mentioned getting more aligned with the other MDBs in terms of process time and efficiency, the 120-day versus 60-day. We know that this has been an ongoing issue, but we'd like to also emphasize that it's about urgency and quality rather than just timelines. There's the old mantra of you can have a process that's fast, cheap, or good, pick two. In this case, it's about being fast and good. That may not be cheap for the ADB or the borrower in this case, but it becomes very important because it's responding to an urgency of need. And one last element, I have many more, but I'll just leave it here. The integrated approach to risk ranking and assessment of loan projects has a double-edged sword aspect to it. And this is something to think about. One of the reasons you have at least these three categories is because you have groups that focus on, are we addressing each of those categories well? And then you're trying to blend that into an overall rating. You have said that the other groups, other MDBs, have integrated ratings. And the question is, how effective are those in delivering against policy? A parallel in the modern financial markets today is the focus on ESG ratings, environmental, social, and governance ratings, where you have unintended outcomes, where a fossil fuel company may be great on governance and great on social benefits, but they're horrible on environment, yet they still get a good rating. And I think that's something to be very cognizant about, and still have a project by project objective review of those elements that contribute to an overall rating, rather than saying, oh, we're good on a few things, but we missed one, but that's okay because overall the project is on balance good. Where it's clearly not, if you're looking at a Paris alignment or overall other bank standards that you're trying to achieve. Anyway, those are my comments, and I'm just wondering, it gets back to, how does this process integrate into those longer term climate and sustainability aspects that must flow through all of these different processes and procedures? Thanks.
Thanks very much, Grant. I will throw this to Bruce. I think there's a lot to chew through there. And, I'm not sure how much you'll be able to respond to, but do your best, and some of it we might have to respond to offline. Bruce.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Thanks very much, Grant. Nice to see you again from previous consultations. Lots of great points that you've come through there. Let me try and track through those, but there is a lot of detail, so I'll try to be concise now, but maybe we can come back on other points. Yeah, firstly, one of the overarching issues around looking at long-term alignment with the Paris Agreement and how we address that, and the need to integrate climate change impacts and have that embedded in the safeguards. So critical point, and we are looking at this one. There's perhaps two levels. We see the alignment with the Paris Agreement being a broader strategic process and a strategic objective for ADB to ensure that overall our entire portfolio is aligned with Paris. And that is a process where we're looking to strategically review, assess, identify projects that ADB should be supporting. This would be a filtering process that we'd go through with our country partnership strategies, looking at in a particular country, what are the types of investments that we should be supporting that are aligned with Paris, and also for our private sector investments, a wider filtering process as well. That would come down to also a review at the concept stage before we decide whether ADB would consider proceeding with further investigation of financing, where we look at is a project Paris aligned, and of course that looks at both the emissions track as well as risks, mitigation, adaptation, resilience tracks. So that's a strategic process that we're going to be doing for all of our investments. In addition to that, we are looking to integrate climate change aspects then in the safeguards. And we're now in the process of considering a separate standard on climate change. We've still doing some internal process to get agreement on it. And actually one of the issues is where does that more strategic process on Paris alignment start and finish, and how does it overlap with the safeguards, and where does that then take the process? So that's one of the discussions we're having. But we see a separate standard would be useful to set out key objectives and requirements on climate change, particularly on greenhouse gas emissions, the assessment of those, and then the management of them. And then how do you look at ensuring that you follow a mitigation hierarchy approach as we do in safeguards, but then also looking at the alignment of those actions with the nationally determined contributions as updated from time to time in the long-term strategies. So that's one aspect. And then on the climate change risk side, ADB has actually since 2013 undertaken climate risk screening. We have a screening assessment process, and then a more detailed climate risk and resilience assessment that we do then for any projects that are considered to be at moderate or high risk to climate change, which is an increasing number. And then there's more detailed assessment. But while that's been useful, we see that it needs to be integrated with the safeguards. And there are the various different standards and issues that are considered in the safeguards, like, say impacts on water, or impacts on soil or biodiversity, that need to then be considered alongside the climate risks and taking a double materiality approach to that. So we want to be able to have that as part of the safeguards, but then still at a strategic level, we want to be able to support our clients beyond an individual project to do kind of wider multi-hazard risk assessment, because you don't get to resilience by just trying to do it on a single project by project basis. So we need both that strategic as well as the project level. So that's how we're seeing it at the moment, but still working on the details. On the points that you were making around financial intermediaries, I very much agree with you. And I think Mark was speaking earlier in terms of the risks of the existing portfolio, but that may not be the same. We do have ambition to increase the role of the private sector, and the role of financial intermediaries could increase, and the riskiness of them, like in the case of the energy transition mechanism, the ETM, could change. So, I mean, very much the modality has to look at how can it be fit for purpose under different types of transactions, the screening of those, and then how do you address different types of risks in that context. One way that we do that at the moment is we do have a process where any individual sub-investments that would be considered to be category A, so our highest risk level potential for significant adverse impacts and risks, either environmental or social, requires a whole range of additional things to be done, further assessment work, ADB involvement in that process, including consultations, documentation to come back to ADB for review and approval in the same way that individual projects would be treated. So we still see that process as being an important part of the FI lending. Now, that's not being used very much at the moment because we're not doing many of those types of investments. Actually, most of the agreements with the FIs specifically preclude them because we take a bit more of a risk-averse approach, and particularly clients that would not maybe have the track record, we stay away from those for the higher risks. But yeah, PTSMI in Indonesia has been developing their own systems, but obviously we still need to look at a robust approach, their environmental and social management system, their capacity, and then what sort of risk and how to manage that. So yeah, I agree with you. So we need to look more at this in the new standards and the approach. Then lastly, sorry if I'm trying to cover everything, but so going quickly. On the risk ranking, the risk screening. So we're not really seeing this as an approach that would try to, ultimately, merge, weight, or blend information in a way that doesn't consider or loses the risk information about key issues. So right now we have the environmental screening and categorization, then for involuntary resettlement, then for Indigenous peoples. I think for environment, it largely works reasonably well, although we have problems with category B. It's a really big bucket, and some can sort of be up, more closer to category A, and some really have very limited risk at all, but they have some risk, and we try and treat those all in the same way. That's the problem for environment. For involuntary resettlement, it's just numerical, and we find that adds no value at all, because it's not just about the number of people, it's about their vulnerability, the significance of impacts to individual households, also the context, so the country framework, the capacity. So just looking at a numerical value that we have now, we find doesn't work. And then for the Indigenous peoples, we're finding that basically we've been avoiding to do work that might impact on Indigenous peoples because of those requirements, and we're trying to change the mindset there, because Indigenous people are a target group to themselves, and we want to be able to increase that work. So we don't feel the existing categorization is really working that well. We want to, though, in the revised approach, have some wider guiding principles for risk screening and categorization, but then actually do a risk assessment for every individual standard that would be triggered, come up with a risk level on each one of those, and then look at how they interrelate with each other. And of course, which standards are being triggered, and what is the significance of those individual ones. And then do you have multiple standards being triggered? Do you have interactions between environmental and social issues? And then the layer also that I mentioned briefly on contextual risk analysis, bringing in that wider context. So we see that information then needs to inform the type and level of assessment, the way we monitor, and a whole range of broader issues. So we don't want to just bring it down and say this, environment weights 60% and the others weight less, and do anything like that. We're trying to come up with something that would help us and the clients manage the risks more effectively. That's what we're thinking at the moment, but again, it'd be good to have further feedback. So I think I've broadly covered most of the key issues. I apologize if I've missed anything in that, but I'll pass back to Richard and Grant if you've got any follow-ups. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Bruce. Just, yeah, I definitely agree with you that just having a numeric weighting thing is just, it loses the substance. And what we want is the performance, not the number. And I think you can see that like in the arguments that are going on around just transition right now, where unfortunately a lot of the argument, I mean, on one hand, it's good. You say, if something's going to happen, what happens to project affected people or people in the immediate impact realm of a transition project? Unfortunately, the discussion is mostly on livelihood and leaves out other aspects like what has been the acute public health impacts of having that job, and is there a more sustainable way for both immediate and regional affected peoples to think about that in a public health context? And so I think having a broader approach to a risk assessment mechanism along these dimensions is very important. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks, Grant. And as we said before, if it sounds like there's lots to chew through and over there, and more information from Grant. So please, Grant, submit any additional questions or observations or comments you might have by email or in the chat box. We did have a question submitted through registration by Masood in Bangladesh, who works for an organization called Sarovi. I don't have a family name, Masood, but if you're online, please let us know what your question is. Okay, I think we may have lost Masood. We can respond to Masood separately. I'm just looking at the clock here. I think the next question is for Mark Broomfield. So Mark, I know you're familiar with ADB, but please let's have your question quickly.
Richard, maybe I can just jump in and answer the question if Mark's not online.
Mark's online, but it's on mute. But yeah, he's already submitted it in writing.
Okay,
so yeah, if you don't mind.
I think everyone can see it in the chat box. It's basically asking what are we planning to do in the policy update to strengthen powers to continue inspecting projects during construction operation, and if we identify problems, how we're going to deal with it. Okay, my quick answer to that is I don't believe the right place to do that is in the safeguard policy. It's much more effective to do that in the legal documentation of a project that then gives us a legal power to undertake inspections, to provide reports to owners, to contractors, etc., identifying issues that need to be corrected and to take actions within a defined time frame. So rather than putting it in the policy, I think the best place to do that was to make sure that everyone is trained up in how to ensure that those commitments are included in legal documents, how to write those clauses, where they fit in documents. And while we do have a lot of leverage during construction, that does continue into operation. So we expect our clients to continue reporting to us during the operation phase. We continue to undertake inspections. We can have our lenders' technical advisors do the same. And again, if there's any issues during operation that are identified, we'd expect corrective actions to be put in place. What leverage do we have? During construction, we can stop funding, and that's a very powerful lever. During operation, that leverage is definitely lessened, but in the event of a very serious default or issue, we do have the potential to foreclose a loan and ask for early payment. So there's a very brief answer. And Mark, I'm happy to talk about that in more detail next time I see you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mark. We have 5 questions in the waiting room. So we've got Linnea Wikström, who's from BWI, the raised hand. Linnea, I'll hand you the mic.
Thanks, everyone. And I just want to say good job with all the consultations for the ADB team, and congratulations for being at the last one. We've gone through quite many this year. I'm really happy with Mark's question, and maybe just highlighting on the other Mark's response. I think there is still a room in the safeguards to highlight the importance of inspection and monitoring, and not only in the procurement documents, because if you have it in the safeguards, there might be also at least a reminder and the explanation to why you put it in the procurement documents. So at times there's a discussion about certain procurement documents that they should be in the standard of FIDIC, for example. And if you already have a policy that supports this, it would be helpful. But back to my question also, I had one on monitoring, but I think we can skip that one. When it comes to private investments or private operations, is there any consideration of doing blacklisting for companies that have ongoing, for example, labor complaints? We see that the World Bank have now started with a blacklisting for gender-based violence, and we think that, of course, there's forced labor and similar complaints or labor court hearings, etc., could be used for similar blacklisting of companies, or at least being a part of the risk assessment. Have this been considered? I think I can do a short question today. Thanks.
Yeah, interesting question, Lynette. So I think that the very quick answer is yes. we have a separate department in ADB called the Office of Anti-Corruption and Integrity that looks after our blacklists or our sanctions lists. And we co-sanction with other institutions. So if World Bank has a company or an individual on a sanctions list, that's automatically included in our sanctions list as well. So that's obviously for clients or companies where we have foreknowledge about these issues. The other point that I've raised earlier is that we do quite extensive integrity due diligence for all our private sector clients across a range of issues, looking at governance structures, tax issues, tax structuring. We also look at adverse media. So if there is anything that is in the press about labour problems at sites with our potential client, human rights issues, corruption issues, court cases, etc. They form a very important part of our initial risk assessment and asking the question, do we want to work with these clients? If we feel that there's still sufficient development benefits and impacts to be gained from working with them, we'll sit down with them, we'll ask them, these are the problems that everyone knows you've had or have. What have you done to deal with this? This director that is listed as being charged for insider trading, why is he still on the board? Why haven't you got rid of him? So we will ask those questions. If we don't come up with the right answers, we won't do business with the company. So I'm not sure that answered your question totally, but I think it gives you a bit of an insight into how we approach that. And yes, we do co-sanction. So if it's a World Bank sanction list, we'll do the same.
Yes, quickly. Currently, we don't have labor as a part of the sanctions from the World Bank. So maybe that's something we could look into together also for the Asian Development Bank. But finally, when you say that we sit down with the party, I guess it would be also of interest to sit down with a complainant. But maybe that's something that can be noted.
Yeah, that could be a possibility. It's a lot more difficult. We're having to approach a third party and say, you're in conflict with this organization or person, please tell us about it. All sorts of issues relating to privacy, retaliation, whether they'd be willing to have a third party out of the blue contacting them, slightly more difficult. In the event that we were very keen to work with somebody and there was a really major issue concerning us, we may take that approach, but it certainly wouldn't be standard procedure.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Linnea. I think Bruce just wanted to add something here on debarment. Bruce?
Yeah, thanks, Richard, and thanks, Linnea. Nice to see you. I've got something coming for you also quite soon. I'll send you a note in the chat. Yeah, it's a really good and interesting question. So just wanted to approach it a little bit more information there. So yeah, ADB does have a policy for anti-corruption and integrity, and we have a very established process on how we do those assessments. And actually there are MDB agreed harmonized principles for sanctions and for the treatment of corporate groups. So there's a process in place, so it's very systematic, and so that's how we've been able to come to agreements on things like cross debarments. And actually at the moment, there's about 3,000 either firms or individuals. I think about 3,000 firms and about 1,000 individuals that are actually on the sanctions list at the moment. But there is a very systematic process for making that as an investigation process that has to be undertaken that can make sure that it's fair, because it can actually be challenged as well. But I think a way to take that up, because it's very relevant. You know, let's say you've got a firm, a contractor, which is consistently having breaches or major issues like breaches of code of conduct or engaged in sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. I think you want to be able to take those into that process. So I'd like to take this into a dialogue actually with some of my colleagues in the Office of Anti-Corruption and Integrity and probably over to procurement as well, because I think it would need to go in to a discussion within those groups that they have between the MDBs and the harmonised principles. We wouldn't be able to just bring it into the safeguards. It would have to move over on that side. So just a bit more of a thought on that. The other aspects also just to touch on is we do need to look more at the whole procurement process and safeguards. And again, we have a separate policy for that. We do already use the standard FIDIC contracts, which have a lot of the safeguard elements already built into them. But that's a constant process of review. And we're wanting to strengthen, this probably more on the sovereign side, but wanting to strengthen some of the requirements that we've got in terms of bidding and contracting requirements around contractor capabilities, the track record, and then remedial actions when they've not met their contractor obligations. So it's another piece that we'd like to look at more. Okay, I'll pass back to you, Richard. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce, and again, thanks, Linnea. Again, lots of stuff to talk through there, and I'm glad you guys can touch base subsequent to this discussion. I think we now go to Benjamin Michel from the OECD, who's had a hand raised for a while. I'll hand the mic over to you, Benjamin.
Hi, I'm Ben Michel from the OECD Center for Responsible Business Conduct, and I try to be brief, and also thank you very much for the opportunity to provide feedbacks. It's also a great opportunity for us to highlight. I think I'm going to highlight this as well, but we've just published at the OECD a paper on responsible business conduct due diligence on project and asset finance. So first, I think what I can echo is everything that has been said by my colleague from OSCHR on, I think, our instrument, the OECD M&E guidelines, and our due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct are fully aligned with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. So I'm fully aligned with everything that has been said. But going into a bit more detail, I think at the OECD in recent years, we've also been doing a stock taking to understand the due diligence practices of DFIs, also MDBs and donor agencies in their financing practices. And this led also to the publication last week, or 2 weeks ago, of a project and asset finance paper. And the goal was really to understand, so we also acknowledge that the main standard at the moment is the IFC performance standards. And the goal is to understand to what extent it aligns with OECD due diligence guidance. We also try to push, and that's something that can be useful for you in your process, to push for, rather go for a compliance approach, which is mainly what's in the IFC performance standard, and a lot of safeguard policies from the different DFIs is go from a compliance approach to a risk-based approach. That's something that can be useful, for example, when you develop or review your risk categorization process. We also try to push for not just an ex-ante approach to financial materiality issues, but really to look at when throughout the project lifecycle and the financing of the project, when exactly does the risk may arise, and it's not only before the financing, it's throughout the process. So and we also try to, as much as possible, align with the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidelines on multinational enterprises for financial institutions to look at the impact of the financing on people and planet, and not only on the financial performance of the asset or the project that it's being financed. Also, one thing that's quite unique for the framework that we're proposing is that most of the time in the different framework that are developed by development finance institutions, that they develop expectations for the client on due diligence. Here, we also say that what are the specific due diligence requirements that the DFI or NTBs has to do. One example is that how to develop this your policy. So that's exactly what you're trying to do and update at the moment. I think what can be useful for you is that in this report, we've also did a benchmark of the due diligence process with the IFC performance standard to really understand what's aligned and what is not. We also, that's something that hasn't been discussed a lot today, but we're also trying to develop a bit more and expand a bit more on when exactly does DFI, or in the case of ADB and multilateral development banks, is involved in a risk, and to what extent it should contribute to remediation. So really, I think that's something that you all know about the involvement framework, at when exactly you're contributing to an impact, causing an impact, or being directly linked. And so we are trying to articulate the different involvement of the financial institutions and the remediation expectations that follows. We also wanted to through the paper, highlight a few points on when exactly that something can be useful. It's when you can manage client confidentiality in terms of disclosure from the risk that arise from the project. So we developed a few recommendations on this. Also, something can be interesting is to what extent you can rely, but not rely too much on collaborations throughout the due diligence process. I think, and to reiterate what my colleague from OSCHR has been saying, we will follow up and extract from the paper what can be useful for your the review and the update of the safeguard, and happy also to follow bilaterally with discussions with our team. But I think that's something that I think can be useful and to consider when looking at what ADB is doing. I think that our benchmark can be useful, our instrument can be useful for you as a financial institutions to conduct due diligence, but also to better identify what we call responsible business conduct in the companies that you're financing. So the benchmark is on the companies that you're financing, but also for yourself. And it can be useful as I think you are increasingly being called to develop some blended finance instruments. The OECD has developed a few standards on blended finance. And most of them also integrate the due diligence, the RBC due diligence framework. So I'm going to stop here.
Thanks, Benjamin. Bruce, I know you were you talked for quite a while previously, but do you want to, in summary form, I'm looking at the clock here, and we've still got 3 or 4 hands and questions in the chat box, but Bruce, go ahead.
We do, yeah, thanks, Richard. And I think that was a hint to be brief, but great points, Benjamin. I'm really excited by that because it's all very relevant. I'm very keen that the benchmarking between the IFC performance standards and the OECD guiding principles, I think that's something that's going to be extremely useful for us. And that was, it's a relevant point also, I think, for the UN Guidebook of Business and Human Rights. So sort of, the intersection of where do we already have key aspects covered, how do the due diligence process address those issues, where are the gaps, things that we should be addressing more in the framework. So when we started this process, we did realize, and this was pointed out by our independent evaluations, was that there was gaps in the existing framework, and we're working to try and address those. But yeah, your processes will also be very helpful for that. And I think the other aspects that you've gone through around managing client confidentiality, responsible business conduct, blended finance, they're all issues that we need to look at. In fact, just taking on the confidentiality aspect, we had this same consultation earlier in the day here for sort of Southeast Asia time, and that issue of around client reporting and confidentiality, and how to address that in a way that allows good transparency on the environmental and social monitoring, but also respect and some of the commercial confidentiality. It's one of those sticking points actually for us right now. So if you've got some work that can help maybe shine some new perspectives on that, it'd be brilliant. So perhaps we can follow up in the new year and connect up, discuss some details. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Bruce. So we've got a couple of questions in the chat from Emily Stutzman and Piet Iben. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And then we see a hand up from Max. So the questions have already been stated in writing, and it's Emily's question is about redactions and about how that may compromise civil society and project affected communities. And then we have a different topic from Piet under the issue of climate change in process, and where do international NGOs' involvement start with respect to the new ADB strategy? I think that second one might be a little bit more straightforward, but Bruce or Mark, if you quickly want to respond to those.
Maybe I'll have a go at asking Emily's first question, and I can quickly handle Piet's question on climate change consultation. So the information disclosure is covered in our access to information policy, rather than our safeguards policy. How do we plan to address the current issue of redactions? Well, it is a problem. Bruce highlighted it briefly in his last answer, but we're faced with the conundrum of that there is quite a lot of information in some of the reports we received that is commercial in confidence, and our clients wouldn't want that to be disclosed. Earlier today, we were talking about this issue with financial intermediaries, and I was pointing out that for a lot of our financial intermediary clients, the reports they provide to us lists their clients and what loans they've made for what purpose. If we disclose that information fully, it gives our clients' commercial competitors a list of their customers that they can then target for business, which is clearly what they don't want. There are some occasions when there may be other information in our project documents that shouldn't be disclosed, proprietary information on particular processes being undertaken at various sites, etc. This is not to say that we're not going to change anything. Bruce and I have discussed this at length on a number of occasions, and we do have to come up with new and better ways of disclosing this information while maintaining this commercial confidentiality. I don't have any immediate answers on what that might look like, but it's certainly something that we need to address. And I think one of the things that we need to do more generally is improve the access to safeguards information, which is a very broad topic, on the ADB website. It is incredibly difficult to find things at the moment, and I think if we had a more friendly landing page and access portal, providing information will become that much easier. Emily, we're running a little bit out of time, and I'd be happy to talk about this in more detail. And I'm sure we'll have opportunities for both Bruce and myself to talk through this with you at some point in the future.
Great, thanks, Mark. And then we had a quite a broad question from Piet, as I say, Iben or Eben. I'm not sure. Apologies if that's pronounced incorrectly, but that's particularly around where Ingo's involvement starts with respect to the new ADB strategy. But I think, Bruce, this particular dialogue that we're having now is one of those, but there are numerous other avenues. So Bruce, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, that's right. So we are in the process of updating ADB's climate change strategy and action plan. That's being led out of what we have at the moment. It's called the Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management Division and Thematic Group. They're leading that process. It links over to the safeguards, like I was explaining before. However, there is a separate process to what we're doing with these consultations. There is an engagement process. Actually, just last week, there was a couple of civil society consultations that were being run in Asia. Probably the best thing for me to do, and I can pop some of this in the chat, is also to link over to our NGO and civil society centre, and also to some contacts in our climate change team that are running that process, so you'd be able to reach out and engage there as well. That sounds okay, but there is an engagement process.
Great, thanks. Thanks for that, Bruce. So we have Mac Darrow, who's had his hand up for quite a while. Mac, do you want to? I'll hand you the mic, and then what we're going to do is just hand over to two final questions from Guoqing Shi from China and Alex Campbell from Washington. So yeah, Mac, over to you.
Thanks very much, Richard, Bruce and colleagues. Really grateful for these opportunities to discuss these issues with you. In the interests of time and where we are, as my colleague Lena said, we'll send through some, an outline of our prepared comments to save time on the call. I'll limit myself to just one or two quick ones. I've just posted in the chat one or two references. The first is into the German government's International Climate Initiative safeguards. And Bruce, really appreciated the way you're thinking about the fact that you're thinking about alignment with the UN Guiding Principles of Business and Human Rights. That's good to hear from our perspective. And the first reference there is just an interesting document in that it encapsulates, I think, to our eye at the moment, perhaps the sort of one of the best examples now of an effort to give effect to one of the things that Lena Wedler, my colleague, was talking about, being that involvement framework and impacts. It's something that can be very abstract to the ear, but needs to be worked through. And so I've just pinpointed, if it's useful, a section in that document, which is probably the best representation that we've seen so far of DFI to give effect to that particular principle. The second reference, in case useful, was work undertaken by the Dutch banking sector agreement a few years ago, gathering in a multi-stakeholder setting, sort of work through how these principles and UN Guiding Principles, responsibility for impacts, relates to the bank itself. And again, that's quite innovative work at the time. And I guess my first question is that the type of exercise that you're contemplating when thinking about UN Guiding Principles alignment, looking at case studies, different types of transactions, different scenarios, actions, potential emissions as well, that influence relationship of the bank itself with impacts? Is that the type of exercise that you're contemplating? Be keen to know that. Two other quick questions. One, in response to Mark Kunze talking about contractual provisions. And Mark, I just wanted to, I think, Bruce, you addressed this question in early consultation, but I'd be curious as to the thinking of ADB now in terms of contractual provisions for remedy. I think expectations around remedying ENS impacts in all kinds of operations, not just PSOs, are still unclear, I think, in many people's minds. Could I just ask what's the current thinking or state of play on embedding clear responsibilities of the client to remedy impacts in contracts, as well as other possible provisions like where it's appropriate for ADB to step in for quick relief through ring-fence funds, for instance, reimbursement rights for ADB, rated provisions like transparency of grievance mechanisms and the like. Do you have any update on that issue? And the final one, it's been touched on a number of times, but transparency. I think safeguard performance really does stand and fall in a very big way on the extent of transparency and accessibility of information. I'm grateful for Felix's point at the outset on meaningful disclosure, but across the board, the Publish What You Fund study in 2021 made for pretty grim reading in this regard. And of course, commercial confidential information is a real sticking point. I think you hinted at that, Bruce. But could I ask, what is ADB's thinking on that issue, and through client contracts, through waivers, in relation to information that is of safeguard relevance or public interest in social environmental matters? Are exceptions, carve-outs for that type of information in client contracts possible, and or working with countries, clients, or industry level to try to change expectations about the type of information that's disclosed publicly, also in the mix? Grateful for any reactions on that issue as well. Thank you.
Mark, do you want to go? Yeah, I'll let you go first, and then maybe
go first, and then I'll let Bruce step in as well. Okay, Max, so some very interesting questions there, and obviously issues that we are currently wrestling with at the moment. So legal provisions for remedy. Legal provisions for remedy are very efficient when we are still in a legal relationship with a borrower. So I mentioned briefly in describing how we deal with the monitoring and implementation requirements in the legal documents. And within those contract conditions, we quite often will say something like, you know, in the event that a non-compliance is identified, a remedial action plan will have to be prepared with clear costings and to be date limited when implementation will be complete. Failure to do so will result in some form of penalty. The more complex issue is how to deal with remedy if our client walks away from the legal agreements, prepays us and says no longer interested in working with you. I don't have an answer to that at the moment, and it's an issue that we're still wrestling with, like every other IFI. From my perspective, I think there are two concerns that we need to address. If we are to present a legal template, a legal document to a client that contains an open-ended commitment for remedy, and it's unclear what the potential cost will be, I think very few of our clients will be willing to sign those sort of contracts. So we're obviously going to have to come up with some slightly different approach. I don't have any obvious answers to that. It's clearly a discussion that has some way to run on that. When it comes to transparency and disclosure, I agree. Safeguards performance it's essential to let people know what's been happening, what we've been monitoring, what the results are, and what any risks are that we're identifying. So we do have in our legal documents a number of provisions for our client on what they have to report to us. From my perspective in private sector, being safeguards orientated and not a banker or a project finance specialist, I'm not too familiar with what all the financial reporting obligations are, but we do require our clients to provide detailed reports on how they are achieving the expected development impacts of a project, and we expect them to report at least yearly on something called the Development Effectiveness Monitoring Report. So we have a design and monitoring framework that has a number of indicators and outputs, and they're required to tell us how they're performing against those. Likewise, for environmental and social monitoring, we ask them to prepare an annual environmental and social monitoring report, and those should be disclosed. As I've mentioned in my last answer, we're still wrestling with the question of commercial in confidence and redaction issues there, but we do, where possible, disclose those. So it should be possible for people to have a look at how our projects are performing. As I've mentioned, that is nowhere near perfect yet, but that is clearly set out in the contract documents to our clients that they will provide this reporting. So let me hand over to Bruce, who might want to provide a few comments here.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Mac. Good to see you. Always good to have you joining these sessions. Appreciate the links and the references that you shared. We'll take a look at those. A few things to add. I think that there is already a broad remedy framework in the way that safeguards are structured in terms of the clear application of mitigation hierarchy and requirements for corrective actions, remedial actions to be addressed. But is there scope for us to strengthen that across the entire process, from project preparation through to implementation, monitoring and supervision, clear requirements in the legal agreements, and then pushing our leverage to be able to implement those? I think, yes, I think we need to look at it across that whole process from end to end. And I think there are some maybe tweaks, language of the policy that we can also provide to try and make that clearer. We are also something that ADB wants to improve on, maybe catch up a bit on what others are doing. We have legal agreements which are fairly broad. I think some of our private sector, the individual agreements or facility agreements may be more specific, but often in our sovereign lending, it's fairly boilerplate in terms of they need to apply the safeguards, they need to ensure implementation of the environmental and social management plans, also reference to our prohibited investment list. But it's fairly high level. But often, particularly in higher risk transactions, you want more specifics in those documents. So we're looking at having a more specific and also more flexible environmental and social commitment plans that can be tailored to projects to address issues. That also can then include, say, for example, if you get into a transaction where there are already corrective actions or legacy issues that might need to be addressed, you can already put that in the framework. So that is an aspect. Grievance redress mechanisms obviously need to be strengthened to provide that feedback loop and to address issues. We are looking at that now. Something that we have to consider is we're about to start a review of our accountability mechanism, and from next year, actually just some aspects of it starting to get prepared now. And we'll be establishing a website for this as well to let stakeholders know. But we're going to be commissioning an independent review of the accountability mechanism. There'll be several studies. They'll look at the existing experiences, they'll look at emerging issues, they'll look at trends across other institutions. That independent study will prepare a report which will go out for consultation. And then there'll also be a cost-benefit analysis. And once we've got that, and then once the safeguards are approved, we'll then embark on an update to the accountability mechanism. And I think that will also provide the opportunity to look at things like institutional remedy in cases. For example, I think you were touching on where there's been a contribution, maybe a non-compliance from our side in not following our policy or providing the wrong advice to a client in terms of their responsibility, where we might have contributed to an issue that's impacted on people. I mean, personally, I do think that's a legitimate area to explore in terms of those cases, what our organizational responsibility may be. So I think that's an issue to explore in that update. But I am, personally a bit wary of doing things like establishing a fund or some financing mechanism to say that if a client did not provide remedy, that ADB would then step in and cover remedy. We see that, and I personally see it as a big moral hazard, as to it actually reduces our leverage to get a client to actually comply if we've set aside a fund and have said that we will cover those costs. Obviously it needs to be explored in more depth, but we do see some problems potentially around that. But on the contractor side, I think that's a very legitimate area. We have already built into contracts default liability aspects. So if the contractor hasn't built something correctly, that gets reviewed and there's a period for them to go through and correct all those. It's not as clear though on the environmental and social impacts that might have been caused by the contractor and their obligations. And things like setting aside performance bonds, which have been used in other sectors like the mining sector, could be usefully employed there. So we've been discussing that, but it goes another step beyond the safeguard policy into the procurement process, which we want to make a bridge over now that we're starting to get more clarity on what policy might look like. Yeah, and then Mark's already talked a little bit about transparency. Maybe this is an issue that we can pick up on more. But the existing access to information policy of the ADB is quite clear that there's a presumption in favour of disclosure, in favour of transparency, with limited exceptions. But that does include for commercial confidentiality issues. Now, we've already flagged up a need to look more closely at that and how it aligns with safeguards. But some of these practical, tricky issues that Mark was talking about, we'll need to kind of really think through how to do that in practice. So I was kind of excited before when Benjamin talked about some of the thinking that they have done in that area, and if there's work that you're doing as well, we'd be keen to look at that too. I better stop there for time, but thank you very much.
Thanks, Bruce. We had a couple of questions posted in the chat, and as I mentioned, one from Guoqing Shi from China. We're a bit unclear about what your question is, but if I could ask you, please, to and very politely to be brief. I'll let you,
thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. And then we'll move on to Alex quickly.
Okay,
as well.
Thank you. And first of all, I think it's the environment and social safeguard is associated the whole project cycle. So ADB highlights the preparation, decision making, procurement, and the implementation in the currently. I just know it's you also want to extend it to the operation stage. And this actually it's good to put the environment and social safeguard in the whole project cycle, from beginning to the end. So this is good. But what kind of, because operation stage is quite long, maybe 30 years, maybe 50 years. And so what kind of a mechanism, what kind of needs we want to have some independent monitoring and evaluation, or some other working mechanism and reporting and automatic supervision. So what kind of mechanisms can be done during the operation stage? So this is something I want to know. Yeah. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Guoqing. Mark, I'll let you chip in, giving some perspective from a private sector view.
Yeah, thanks. It's an interesting question, and I think the answer is it depends on the project and the risks associated with it. So from an ADB perspective, our monitoring is complete when we get to the point where we've prepared a project completion report. At that point, we feel that we have sufficient knowledge of how the operations have been implemented and whether there are any residual risks or issues. If not, then fine. We can say we feel that this particular project is operating as designed, it's delivering its development impacts, it's not delivering any significant environmental or social impacts anymore, therefore we're happy to provide the completion report. That period is going to be very, very different depending on the type of project we're looking at. The big infrastructure projects, and I'm thinking particularly about hydropower projects here, our monitoring and reporting requirements may run for 10 to 15 years into operations. Because the impacts associated with the project were so sensitive and significant and extend over such a wide area, we feel that long-term monitoring is required to give us the satisfaction as to whether the project is meeting its outcomes. For smaller projects, for example, say a waste-to-energy plant in Asia, we may look at a period of up to five years of operation, have a look at their annual monitoring reports, their compliance with their licensing and permitting requirements, their requirements with reporting to ADB, whether there have been any significant environmental events that they've had to report to us. If we feel that the plant is operating as designed and there are no significant residual issues, we would then again do our project completion report, say at 5 years. In private sector, we have something called early operating maturity, where we determine whether we want to do a project completion report. So for some of our investments, say in the education sector with schools, that may be very, very short. It may only be 2 or 3 years of operation before we're happy to sign off on it. Our involvement in a project obviously runs as long as the loan does. We still have some rights that we can exert during a fairly long period. Now, our sovereign loans can have tenors of up to 30 years. So we still have some rights to, if we feel that things have gone disastrously wrong or we need to react to something, we could, in a very significant event, call the loan in and ask for early repayment. However, that's very unlikely. And the tenor of Private sector loans are much shorter. A 15-year loan in private sector is very long. A lot of what we're doing is 5 to 7 year financing, maybe 10 years for infrastructure.
This is good. Yeah, I think this is significantly different because in China for hydropower, actually, we have a post-relocation support. It's 20 years now. So we also carry out some monitoring, annual monitoring and evaluation. And for mining, I think it's also need this kind of special mechanism because mining is not only the construction, actually operation is more longer. Yeah, so especially also have a significant environment and social impacts for hydropower and the mining projects.
So ADB, I don't think has financed a lot of mining projects, certainly in recent decades. But you're right, there are a number of issues relating to remediation and restoration that would need to be covered to ensure that that we're not leaving behind an environmental disaster and other legacies. So yeah, I totally agree with you. It's a long-term commitment.
Yeah, but it's also increased quite a lot of cost. Also, not only for the private sector company, but also ADB itself.
Yes, agreed.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Right. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Gurking. I think I see that Alex Campbell's unfortunately had to drop off, but he's promised to reach out separately. But we do have one final question from Angelina Fisher at NYU Law School, where she has submitted a question in the chat about risks related to digital technologies in the context of private sector funding. I do appreciate that this was previously submitted with regard to our sovereign financing, but perhaps Bruce, if you really want to quickly respond to this one, and then we'll close the chat. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yes, we did actually have a really interesting session with the NYU Law School that presented on this, and it had previously been flagged by Mac Darrow and the UN Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, and also through some of our board members. So ADB has already been doing some work on this, established a working group. We've developed already some internal risk screening processes to look at certain types of digital technologies that would have risks and would require assessment. For the safeguards, at this stage, we're looking to have a sort of a tag or a flag that says, assessments should consider risks associated with digital technologies, but then have that then be taken up through a further risk screening process that would be implemented by our digital technologies team. And they're also in the process of developing a guidance for that. We think it needs to have a guidance that can also be updated regularly because of the rapid pace of change around some of the technologies. And the difficulty in being able to anticipate some of the risks that could occur there. But certainly things like, say, the use of facial recognition technologies, we've already been screening in our projects and doing some due diligence work around those. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Bruce. Yeah, thanks, Angelina. Noted your response there. Thanks to everyone. I'm going to hand back to Gelson, recognizing that it's 11:30 p.m. here in Manila. But yeah, over to you, Gelson. Thanks, Bruce and Mark and the others for your participation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Richard, and our respondents from ADB, and more importantly, our participants. We went over time, which only speaks about the rich and substantive comments we have received from this consultation, as well as the practical recommendations from some of you. We hope that we have provided some clarity to the many points you raised, and this will be taken into account as ADB starts reflecting on the range of feedback we received from many consultations so far that will then feed into the drafting of the new policy. Please don't go just yet. We have a quick survey which is now being flashed on your screen. It asked you to please rate us how satisfied you are with today's session. and it's going to be a few seconds and we will flash the results. And there's also a link on Menti, which is on your chat box. Please open it, and I think there's also so you can provide your specific comments on specific areas where we can improve further, especially since we will be preparing for the next rounds of consultation next year. Are we ready to flash the result, Jen? Oh, wow. After an extended Q&A, you gave us 100%. I hope that won't change. So thank you very much for that. And now, before I turn you over to Bruce for a synthesis of what we have heard, I just want to say thank you for being part of the last session of the 19th set of consultation of ADB for this year. So congratulations, we're able to finish the 19th consultation before the year ends. So on that note, I will now bring you back to Bruce for a synthesis. Bruce.
Great, thanks, Jelson. And thanks so much, everyone, for joining today. I don't know about the poll. We may not have many people left on the call. Maybe it was one person that enjoyed it, stayed on to the end. We did go a bit over time, but I'm really grateful for the feedback. And actually, this was a really useful session. Really a lot of very, very helpful points, and also guidance for us in terms of the availability of other resources and issues to think through. I try to just sort of quickly sum up a few of the key points that we need to look at and dig into more. Certainly on financial intermediaries, we are looking at the lessons and experiences. But I think a key point that did come up from Grant was on the modality and the requirements that we set on it being fit for purpose for the different types of transactions and the different types of risks that we may have in the future, including the work around the energy transition. I very much take that point. Also around the Paris alignment on climate change and how that dovetails with the safeguards. It's wider, but certainly does link through and is a key consideration for us as we look at developing a standard with information on climate change. Also, we had a number of recommendations quite substantively on key processes and guiding principles. The UN guiding principles on business and human rights, also the OECD guiding principles and the benchmarking work and other analysis. Very useful frameworks, and they're keen to look more closely at both of those and have follow-up conversations around them. We had some important points around risk screening and categorization. I spoke a little bit about how we're thinking to do it, and we also had some advice on some things to avoid, like weighting criteria and blending it to the point where you really lose resolution. Key message was that the risk guidance really then needs to drive the performance requirements and the monitoring and then what we do in practice. Also, quite a number of points about information disclosure, questions around dealing with commercial confidentiality and the redaction of information, and how we can ensure transparency and information disclosure. We recognized some of the, well, I think we recognized the need to strengthen that, but also highlighting some of the issues and challenges. And I think there are a number of you out there that are working on some of these issues that we can get some further guidance on. We touched on issues like procurement and safeguards, and question also from Linnea at BWI, or a recommendation for looking at the client or contractor performance and issues like blacklisting and debarment and how those processes could be assessed, which I think is a good legitimate issue. If you can send a message that poor performance and non-compliance in these issues at very egregious and repeated level is not something that we want to see or tolerate and affect procurement in the future. I think that is a strong message, so it's worth picking that up. We also got into issues around remedy, legal provisions, and also the whole ecosystem and how that can be strengthened. Also, towards the end there, Professor She's also highlighting around the whole monitoring and looking at the project cycle and the length of that with long-term projects, and Mark was discussing also how we address that. And then lastly, on digital technologies, which, very much an emerging area that is changing some of the risk issues that we may not have considered in the past and should be considered. So that was a very quick summary of a very rich consultation and some great recommendations and topics for us to look at further. So really great thanks to everyone. Now, moving ahead, now this is our last consultation of many that we've had this year, and I'm really thankful to all of you. In fact, I feel like we've grown sort of a community of friends and colleagues, and I see many of you giving your time again and again. I feel like I'm making friends virtually here, but really value your advice. Moving though into the next stage, so we're documenting, posting summaries of the sessions. We've got quite a bit to catch up on that, but we're planning to get those out. Then in the new year, I gave a bit of information on the next steps in my opening remarks, but I won't repeat that, but just to say that as we work towards making the public disclosure of the first drafts in around the first quarter next year, once that's out, and then we've had some discussion with our board, we will then go into another stage of consultations. We're looking at how to do that effectively, but at that stage you'll have a draft, and we will then kind of want to go into more sort of sharp and focused consultations around getting feedback, hopefully written feedback, but also some focus groups on different topics. So we're looking at that. And we will announce a proposal also on our website. So that'll be also coming in the new year. So till then, thanks again, and wishing everyone, if you're having holidays or taking a break, really safe and happy holidays, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the new year. Thanks again. Take care.